Welcome to Explore, Explain, Highlights. In this Highlights package, we'll be looking at Season 4, Episode 5, with our guests Lora Oehlberg and Samuel Huron, discussing the project Making with Data.
We can look at the definition as a sort of lineage of physicalizations going back thousands and thousands of years. But one thing that's kind of made clear quite early in the book is that this is a contemporary look at where things are in terms of methods and techniques now. And it's a showcase, as you said, you've kind of created a space for the makers of these works to sort of tell the story themselves. Was that contemporary sort of filter and or caveat an important motive for the four of you working on this book, or was it just an inevitable thing? We need to find a way to cope with the amount of content we could include, so let's just say, right, it has to be contemporary.
I think for us there was a certain pragmatism to it, because while we have sort of evidence and historical record of data physicalization going back centuries and thousands of years, we don't have access to the people who made them. So we have the artifacts, but sometimes we don't even have the data. And we definitely do not necessarily have the process or the rationale behind it. So a lot of it came down to who could we find to tell the story, and grounding that story in one piece. Many of the people we talk to, this is their practice. It's not just, I made this one piece and I'm going off to my next thing. This is actually something that they've thought very deeply about. And in each chapter we talk about kind of the motivations, and it sort of flows a little bit, where someone will start talking about the piece before, and then they'll start talking about the piece afterward, and how the particular chapter, the particular artifact is situated in the broader arc of their work. So for us, it was partially pragmatic, and also I think for us it's reassuring to think of it as a snapshot, because this book will live on beyond its publication date, and there are still people who are making data physicalizations right now, and we can't include them in the book because the book has been published. So the way I like to think of it as not necessarily contemporary as in this ongoing thing, but very much so a snapshot of when we were working on the book, who we could find who would be willing to share their stories.
Right, and I guess by giving people the chance to talk about their projects as case studies, that in itself is built upon the techniques that have been established for thousands of years. So they'll talk to and speak to that sense of, they've not just made this up themselves, they've learned from what's gone before.
I think we had multiple criteria. So the first one was clearly to get a sense of balance between every chapter, because there is clearly some really, really good projects in other sections that we couldn't include. The second point was to have something which was kind of ready for publication and well documented. As you saw in the book, we tried to get some clips and visual element of the process, like sketches or intermediate prototypes, things like that. And another point was also we tried to reach to some people that didn't reply in time, so it was not really used. It was not really. But yeah, I think. What was the other elements that were really important for us? To have a lot of visual content. That was really important.
And just to jump in,
Lora, go ahead.
I was going to say, just to jump in real quick, I think part of that is also because at artists and practitioners, we get so used to having the glamour shots of the final thing, but we don't necessarily have glamour shots of process. And so for us, we had people who had fantastic artifacts, good stories behind them, but then when it came to the making sure that they had a visual story to tell about how they arrived there, that was the challenge. It was tricky to figure out, okay, how many images can I muster that show everything from like the conception all the way through to like the final messy implementation. Not everyone has the images and ready for publication images of those pieces of the process. I mean, we're all kind of as researchers at the end of the day, so we do have this notion of communication as a goal in our core. That said, art communicates just at a very different level. So there are several of the pieces in the handcraft section, like Mika West's Anthropocene Footprints comes to mind, Laura Manson's Happy Endings comes to mind, where being able to read, it's not about reading data points.
Sure.
It's not about, there's a little booklet that goes with it if you care about it. But in many ways, it's trying to almost like figure out ways to communicate the gestalt of the data in the case of Anthropocene Footprints, because the data is there in the materials that were used to build these sculptures.
Right.
Like, but again, you're not going to read it. You're going to get a sense of the data, a sense of the trend overall, but not necessarily, this is the specific emissions data that I'm reading from this particular possible future. So I'd argue they all communicate data, but on different levels and with different goals in mind. Where you encounter these pieces, because they are physical, they inhabit space just like you or I do. Yeah. And so some of these like the Anthropocene Footprints and endings, you sort of encounter in a gallery space where your mindset is, I am an art goer, I'm here to experience art. Oh, there's data behind this art, and that's the beginning of your series of questions. If we think about some of the more participatory approaches, like Seaboat, for example, you are in the space that is currently being queried, and you're an active participant in it. And as that changes the relationship and what exactly is being communicated. And in some
that sort of situatedness is obviously very important.
Yeah, and other pieces are, like, especially in automation, are sort of these visualization platforms almost that are being shown predominantly in research communities for the time being. And even that, again, sort of changes the purpose of the visualization in some ways. You are communicating data, but in other ways, you're communicating the potential of this platform to go even further. So what it's communicating also very much so depends on who made it, but also where it's being shown to people in our physical reality that we live in.
But I think what I find interesting is, and I really love visualization, and I think I will still work a lot in visualization. It's just, to me, thinking about the other way we are representing data with physical object, with participation, or with environmental procedure. Always it's helped me to challenge the definitions that I already have and to think about new ideas also for visualization. And that's one of the things that one of the reason or one of the motivation why I love that. Still, I think in a way we might see more and more physical representation around us. I think some of this representation could be really useful in a lot of context and in a lot of cases. So. Right. I think they are not in competition.
Yes, yeah, they're all in the same circle packing diagram, shall we say? Yeah. Any thoughts on that yourself, Laura?
Yeah, it's like as someone who, like I mentioned, I come from sort of a design research background, and I'm sort of meandering into visualization. I find it interesting to think about how some of the backbone, data visualization as a field of study is so much more developed than like physicalisation or like the notion of data in fabrication communities. And the type of conversation that visualization designers have, the type of like super nuanced, detailed, thoughtful conversations around data that they have, trust me, do not necessarily happen in fabrication communities. Right. And they're just sort of now trying to wrap their head around what does it mean to have something that is data driven, that I'm digitally fabricating, or wait a minute, I could use a parametric design approach. They have other types of language, and that translation is starting to happen. Right. I feel like all of the groundwork from the visualization community is still critical to understanding kind of new mediums for representing data. Because I know with Sam, I've talked multiple times about like what are the Bertin equivalent, visual variables for physical variables, and that just breaks everyone's brains every single time. Right. But because we have Bertin to look at for inspiration, to say like, well, visualization has at least figured out a backbone. It's still evolving, but like there is a backbone to sort of think about and reference. That's been extremely valuable. So I still feel like visualization is relevant. And again, it's that matter of expertise in your medium, so to speak. And so you might not be a furniture designer or a professional theater production company, but if you are a trained graphic designer, then visualization is going to be your happy home by all means, and where you know how to flex the most. So I don't think everyone has to become a data representation person.
Right.
But I think like recognizing that we have this umbrella that we all kind of share, and starting to sort of reach out and see if we can find common ground, common language to work within. Oh, I was going to say the other sort of editorial challenge I think we probably had more issues with academics who professionally write than with, artists and practitioners who don't have to write narratives. It's like they actually were very lucid about their process. It's the academics, man. Because
that's the episode tagline.
it's the academics, man. Because all of us have academic credentials. You're being approached to write a book chapter, and your first notion is, I am writing a chapter of a book. And the type of language and level of language started to get very jargony and not as descriptive in some ways, because the urge is to think at that meta level, and we have places to do that in the chapters. But we had to, in many cases, try to give more coaching to the academics to back off, to say, like, it's okay, you can just tell us how it went, and it does not have to be the same level of language, because we wanted to make sure the book was accessible. I mean, for us, it was less about making sure that everyone's voice was sort of consistent across the book. The structure helps with that a lot, but it was much more making sure that we didn't have a jarring shift into,
of course,
strange academic language all of a sudden popping up after I've heard a very personal story about, this is how my project went, and then all of a sudden you have someone who's used to writing academic conference and journal papers, where you have your formal description of methods that doesn't quite make sense given the type of book we were trying to aim for.
Sure, and I suspect that one place where that manifests is where you acknowledge that these creative processes are not linear in real life. They're messy, they're imperfect, there's wastage, there's things you've done wrong, go back. And I suspect that the artists, the creators in your kind of cohort were perhaps more comfortable with that idea than the academics. But you also mentioned that we have to force this into a linear process because that's how a book works. But we can also embrace the messiness and the uncertainty. Samuel, jump in.
Yeah, no, it was again on the vocabulary, because one of the things I remember we had this discussion because we wanted to have the book accessible for non-academic. One of the things we really clearly have done was suppressing the jargon. But suppressing this jargon, we had this issue. It's like everybody was using a different word: data visualization, data physicalisation, or indexical representation. So we put this page inside the introduction where we try to collect some of this definition and make a visualization of them, kind of.
Thank you for joining us for this Explore, Explain highlights episode. As always, the full episode is available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. We hope to see you again soon on another episode of Explore, Explain.